We will move on to the next session, which is a leadership keynote by Professor Soumitra Dutta. The keynote is on inclusive digital acceleration and innovation. Professor Soumitra Dutta is a professor of management at the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University, New York. He is also the founder and president of Portulans Institute, a Washington, D.C. based non-partisan, non-profit institute focused on research and outreach on technology and innovation. Previously, he was the founding dean of the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business and the 11th Anne and Elmer Linsett Dean of the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management. Prior to July 2012, he was the Roland Berger Chaired Professor of Business and Technology at INSEAD and the founding director of eLab, a center of excellence in the digital economy. Soumitra Dutta, sir, brings a unique perspective on business and technology strategy in a global world with a PhD in artificial intelligence and computer science from the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Dutta brings a deep grounding in data sciences and advanced technologies. He has spent more than 3 decades of his career in leading business schools across the Atlantic in INSEAD and Cornell University, wherein he has conducted extensive research in and consulted with leading global firms on building effective technology and innovation strategies. We are deeply honored to have Professor Soumitra Dutta amongst us today. I now hand over the session to Professor Dutta for his keynote on inclusive digital acceleration and innovation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Raki, for your kind words of introduction. I'm indeed delighted to be taking part in INFOCOM this year, and a very warm welcome to all delegates today for this presentation. As Raki mentioned, I spent about 3 decades of my professional career looking at issues of technology and society, technology and competitiveness. And I wanted to share with you some work that I have been doing actually for the last 2 decades around this theme of network readiness. So what does it actually mean for societies, for companies, for countries to be more ready for this networked era that we're living in today? This piece of research is called the Network Readiness Index. And we just released the 2021 edition of the report yesterday. So I just thought it'll be very timely if I share the results with you and some of the key findings from the study with you. The next slide, please. So my presentation has 3 parts. So I will first talk about the notion of network readiness. I will talk to you about the rankings and some of the key findings from this year's study. And of course, I will conclude with some key messages and takeaways. The document, the report summarizing the report, the results is shown on the right-hand side. And I encourage you to, in fact, go and search for it online. And essentially, you can download the report for free, download the data, analyze different countries. We have more than 130 countries covered in this report. The next slide, please. So let me begin with the first part of the presentation is what is the NRI? The next slide, please. So this is a good, let's say, starting point. Now, I must tell you that we started on this journey in 2002 at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. And in 2002, the World Economic Forum convened a group of experts to try to think about what is the framework that we can use for thinking about technology and its impact on societies and governments. In 2002, we came up with the first model of the NRI, which was, I would say, looking backwards, quite far-sighted, because in 2002, we included aspects about the societal aspects, the governmental aspects, the regulation aspects, which in 2002, no one was thinking about. The thinking then was really around bits and bytes and PC penetration and so on. Now, over the years, we have also evaluated and modeled the impact of technology in different ways. And about 3 years ago, we did another major overhaul of the NRI model to reflect some of the current priorities. The model is shown on the right-hand side. So if you see you have 4 pillars out there: technology, people, governance, and impact. And the basic premise behind the model is very simple, is that we need to combine technology and people with the right governance structure to have the right impact on society and on lives. Now, what you will notice out here in this model is that we have a number of, let's say, usual features like, let's say, technology access, technology content, the aspect of people and governments and societies. But also what we have is a number of interesting aspects that are highlighted much more. Under governance, you will see the notion of trust, inclusiveness, very, very important these days. Under impact, you will see not just economic impact, but also quality of life and the SDG goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Under technology, you will see future technologies, because today is not just a question of access to basic technology. What we're finding is that countries that are investing more in future leading edge technologies like AI are actually doing much better in many ways. So this model has 4 pillars. We have 12 sub-pillars, and we use 60 indicators. Again, I will not go through the details of all the indicators, but I can tell you that this piece of work is the longest standing global technology index today that we have. It has been used by many, many countries, including the government of India, to think about and to analyze the nation's technology strategy. And I encourage you to actually look at the model by downloading the report and reading about it in more detail. The next slide, please. Now, one of the issues which we focused on this year's report is really the notion of what kind of a recovery are we headed for? Are we headed for a K-shaped recovery in which, after the sharp decline at the start of the pandemic, now we're coming out and there's a certain segment of companies, certain segment of countries that are going back very fast, and a certain segment of society, certain segment of the countries who are not in fact progressing that fast, and we have a sort of division across them, the K-shaped curve on the left-hand side? Or in fact, are we heading towards a more V-shaped recovery in which everyone progresses and everyone benefits from it? Now, that's a big question mark before all of us. And in many ways, technology is part of the solution, also part of the problem, incidentally. Because what is happening is the companies and the countries that are investing more in technology are in fact going faster up on the upward V-shaped curve of the recovery. The companies and the countries that are not investing more in technology are the ones that are probably lagging behind. But at the same time, what we know is that technology is critical. It's critical for being able to create that kind of V-shaped recovery. We will have to use technology for key areas like education, health, and other kinds of aspects linked to human development. And we know that, for example, we'll never have enough teachers, enough doctors, enough people to handle all the different aspects of societal growth and societal development. So technology will have to play a key role. So I think the key question for us in terms of looking forward is, what kind of a recovery are we looking for? Of course, we want all societies, all countries to progress. And out there, technology will have to play a key role, especially given the digital acceleration we have seen during the pandemic. The next slide, please. So now I'll talk to you about the 2021 rankings. Now, keep in mind that these rankings are relative rankings. Relative rankings showing how are different societies progressing on this network readiness. And keep in mind also that network readiness is measured by those 4 pillars. So it's not just only technology or data speeds or data cost, which is one part of technology content and access. We're looking at the overall picture of how a society is ready, how a country is ready to deploy technology and use it with a positive impact. The next slide, please. So here you see in our results, the NRI 2021 rankings. And you see Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, USA to be in the top 4 positions. If you look at the top 10 countries out here, what you see is that essentially it is all high-income economies. And you have a mix of countries from Europe, which dominates the Americas, and of course, Asia Pac, with Singapore there at position number 7. Now, what is interesting, of course, is this causality correlation sort of paradox or the challenge between this finding that we see that usually high-income economies dominate these tables or rankings. In fact, all the top 25 are high-income economies. And that's where the issue becomes one of trying to understand better. Is it because they are more wealthy and more rich that they're able to invest more in leading edge technologies and digitalization of economies? Or is it the fact that they have chosen to digitalize the economies explicitly, and that has in fact created the wealth in those economies? And this is something which is a very key question about, chicken and egg kind of a story. And you have examples of success stories both ways. Finland, ranked number 5 out here, was an economy based on natural resources for a long time. And then in 1989, they went through a national transformation, a determined move to invest more in knowledge economy technology. And 20 years later, 30 years later, they are one of the leading tech nations. So Finland was not a tech nation. It chose to invest in technology and it became that way. If you compare, for example, Europe and America, Europe in general, if you look at some countries, leaving aside the leading countries out here, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, a lot of Central Eastern European countries do not do as well. And the key difference between the Central Eastern European countries and other European countries in America is that these American and the Western or Scandinavian nations invest much more in technology. So is it a question of choice that they're making of investing more in technology? So that issue of correlation causation is a very complex one. But the good news out here is that some countries like China and Malaysia are in fact upper middle income economies that are coming closer. So China is ranked 29 this year, so coming closer to the top 25, and Malaysia is ranked number 38. Now, if you look at, for example, the next slide, please. So if you look at, for example, the rankings by pillar, what you see is an interesting sort of collection of nations leading on each dimension. The observation that I would make out here is that even though the USA leads on technology, the USA does not necessarily lead on the other dimensions. And this is the reason why the USA is not necessarily ranked number 1, even though it's ranked number 4. It's very, very good. But you see that different nations have achieved different levels of success in different dimensions. And so what a ranking like this actually does give us is indications of what kind of best practices or good practices exist in different nations. And that can actually help us to understand how we create this inclusive technology recovery or technology-enabled global recovery that we're seeking in the world today. Next slide, please. Now, we have a number of rich data points, not just 2021, but 20 years. And so obviously you can conduct a variety of analysis. I will not really go through the whole analysis with you. I will focus much more on giving you the key messages. But here you see, for example, one simple analysis looking at the top rankings of nations by income groups. So you see, for example, in the lower middle income group, India is ranked number 67. And of course, India is doing very well on some aspects. Mobile penetration has gone up very high. The Aadhaar platform, the JAM system is working actually quite well in many areas. The India Stack UPI success stories. But those are, I think, initial success stories that is helping the country move forward. Because what has happened in India is that the whole digitalization sort of move started, I would say, a few years later than, for example, in China. And this gap of a few years, in fact, is the reason why India is lagging behind in some aspects, but the overall dimensions actually are progressing quite nicely. And India is the fastest rising nation this year in the rankings, rose up by almost 20 positions in the ranking. The next slide, please. This is another view of the world in this NRI rankings, the top rankings by region. In Africa, of course, you have South Africa, Mauritius, Kenya at the top rank. But in Africa, if you actually look at the details of African success stories, what is interesting is that you're seeing these shoots of green success stories. green shoots appearing across the continent, where some countries like Rwanda, for example, even though they're ranked overall quite low, they are in fact deploying technology much more effectively and moving up faster in relative terms on the technology and the economic development curve inside their own continental context in Africa. The next slide, please. My last slide on the performance, and I'll move to the messages. So here you see, for example, on the vertical axis, you have the NRI score, so the rankings on network readiness. On the horizontal axis, you have the GDP per capita, the wealth level in PPP terms. And what you see, again, what I mentioned at the start, you see a fairly strong correlation between, let's say, the NRI score and wealth level. But you see that there are some countries who are overachieving relative to the regression curve, the line. Some countries are above that line, and some countries are below that line. Now, you will see that the big green circle out there is actually India. The big blue circle out there is China. And the other smaller, bigger light blue circle is USA. The green circle is India, is above the line. And what you see out here is that India is overachieving compared to its income level group. So compared to other nations that are performing at the same income level, India actually is doing much better than others. But of course, India has still a long way to go if it wants to increase its network readiness to the levels of USA or of China. Let's next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is focus the next few minutes on the key messages and takeaways. So we've done the study this year, released the results yesterday, done the study for 20 years. So what are some of the key messages from this year's study that sort of captures a lot of these elements? The first message is very simple. We all know that digital transformation is a priority, but the pandemic has turned that into a global imperative. The digital acceleration that has happened in the pandemic, basically today, and the need for a V-shaped recovery, a more inclusive recovery, implies that we have to have a global imperative on leveraging digital technologies. Next slide, please. The second message is really that, interestingly and unfortunately, the digital transformation has highlighted some existing divides and created new divides. And these divides are across nations, across sort of geography, across gender, across age, across rich versus poor, across urban versus rural. If you think of example, gender, historically, we knew that even before the pandemic, there was a gender divide. Women typically and girls typically had lower access to technology as compared to men and boys. And now what the pandemic has done has actually created the divide and made it more explicit even more. More women have left the work. More women and young girls have not been able to study because of lack of access to technology. And so what we see is that, unfortunately, digital transformation has also created new divides and highlighted existing ones as a result of the pandemic. So this should be motivation for us to try to do something about it. Next slide, please. Technology can help equalize a global recovery, and this is a point I made earlier, that essentially in areas like health and green infrastructure and other aspects of education, we need to have technology. Otherwise, you cannot. We'll never have enough teachers, never have enough nurses and doctors. So technology will have to be an aid in helping drive a more V-shaped recovery. So I really believe that technology, and this is the result coming out of the survey also, that if you want a more equal global recovery, technology will have to play a very key role in that process. Next slide, please. So what we also see, and this is a result that we find from 20 years of work, is that the countries that do better in network readiness or in using technology have a balanced, holistic approach towards technology. It's not a question that they are just investing more in connectivity or just in lowering the price of access. Yes, those are very important. The technology pillar, the access and the content dimensions are very, very important. But at the same time, what you do need is a holistic approach. You need a holistic approach that looks at all the 12 sub-pillars of the 4 pillars that we have in the model to be able to create that kind of a harmonious, I would say, integration technology and people. And these kinds of issues are becoming even more important as AI is entering the domain. I mean, how do you in fact handle situations where AI can potentially remove so many jobs? How do you actually enable AI to support human beings in what they're doing, empower human beings, make them more capable, make them better? So I think this notion of how technology and people come together is very important. And for that, we need to have a holistic approach that looks at elements like trust, inclusiveness, regulation, socioeconomic, societal impact, and other issues, and not just only pure technology metrics. And this is the danger that we often have. We look at pure technology metrics and we think that, okay, we have reached the pinnacle of success story technology, because technology alone does not lead to the right impact necessarily. The next slide, please. What we find also is that technology today has become quite accessible to all countries. So what we mean by a fair game is that a country with determined leadership can actually make big improvements in technology. You see that a success story is India, for example. India is a low-income country, but India has made tremendous progress, a determined move on technology in the last few years. Look at Rwanda and Africa, again, another poor country, but has again used technology very determined manner with good leadership to help move the country up. So I do believe, and the results show this, that even less wealthy economies can in fact use technology more effectively just because technology has become more easeable, more easy to use, and more accessible. Think of, for example, cloud services. Today, cloud services of pretty advanced nature is available to any small startup in India or in Africa. And that is something which a company, let's say a small company, especially in India, could not afford 20 years ago or 30 years ago. For accessing advanced technology services, you typically need to have a big company with enough resources. So I think this is a very important element of how the fact that with proper leadership, any company, any country can actually access technology and improve its own performance. The next slide, please. What we are finding, as I mentioned earlier, that even though there is a concentration of the rich nations at the top of the economy, there are some countries that are actually moving up. And the list out here is there. China, Ukraine, Vietnam, India, Rwanda are few of the economies that are actually moving up and closing the performance gap. So this is a good example of how the digital champions at different income levels. So you have champions at different income levels. They are in fact making a determined push towards investing more in technology and moving up and closing the gap with other leaders in the space. And the last slide, please, the last message. I think this is a very important message, is that ultimately you have to ask the question, why invest in technology? And of course, people always have made the argument that investing in technology is good for economic development, good for improving productivity. And I think we have used technology mainly as a tool for improving productivity. But today, after 20 years or more of experience with looking at technology use in societies, we all know that technology is much more than just a tool for economic productivity. Technology is a very essential tool for helping create entrepreneurs in society. Entrepreneurship, for example, is very important for helping young people, give hope and give them hope and to create new things. Technology is very useful if you want to provide education to the masses in India. India has large numbers of people who are not necessarily, have the right access to education or to health. So if you want to provide basic health education to them, technology will be a key aspect to it. So what I'm just trying to say is that just technology alone is not enough. We have to use it to create value for societies, give young people hope, give education, give health, give other kinds of infrastructure services, help small businesses, and so on. And so you need to be able to look at this whole thing as a holistic manner to be able to achieve success in technology. The last slide, please. So I just want to thank you for your attention. You have two URLs at the bottom out there. Please to look at the URLs, networkreadiness.org. That's where you can download all the information about this report I talked about. Portulans Institute is my think tank in Washington, D.C. that I had co-founded. And we essentially do a lot of research around technology, innovation, and talent. I think these three areas, technology, innovation, talent, are very much linked together. And we do a lot of research on that. So you're welcome to come and look at the work we do. If you want to connect with me personally, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the source that I use the most in terms of social media. And I encourage you to come and connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity to present to you. And I hand the floor back to the organizers.
Thank you, Professor Dutta, for joining us, and it has been a sheer delight listening to you. Thank you so much for taking time out for us and joining us at INFOCOM.